This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios Podcast Network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, rate the podcast on Spotify, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. If you find yourself in the middle of doubt, deconstruction, the dark night of the soul, you do not have to go through it alone. Join our private Facebook group, Deconversion Anonymous. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. Arlene interviews today's guest, Benji, of Hey There Benji fame on Instagram. Benji was adopted. His adopted parent became religious. He found himself in the middle of a religious context that he threw himself into. He became a worship leader, but as time went on, things were not good with his adoptive parent, and things were not great within the church as well. Things like the inherent racism within the church became obvious to Benji over time. Now Benji uses his online presence to help people who are also going through the deconstruction process. You can find him on Instagram at Hey There Benji. Here is Arlene interviewing Benji.
Hi, Benji. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm super excited. You and I connected off and on last year, and then recently we are living vaguely near one another.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is exciting. I'm excited to hear your story. In a few weeks, I'll be able to hear your partner's story, and this is great. I'm glad you're going to be able to be on. So usually how we start is just tell us about the religious environment you grew up in.
Sure. So I'm strange in the sense that I didn't get into a religious environment until I was, in my tween, adolescent years into my teenage years. And so in some ways I came into it with a real understanding of what was going on. I know a lot of people probably, they grow up in it and that's all they know, but I still remember a life before it. And I think it happened because my adoptive parent was starting to get back into church themselves. They were sensing a need for spirituality in their life, and they started bringing me and my younger brother to church. And so that's kind of how it started. It was a really weird start because, like I mentioned, I didn't come from that. I came from kind of an a-religious thing, and then was kind of dropped in the middle of this world with its own context, with its own kind of, reference points, and didn't really understand it. I came to understand it later, certainly, but it was very, very strange in the very beginning.
I did too. I did not become a Christian or become really acquainted. Well, in high school, my mom started taking us to church, or taking me to church. I say us, it was she forced my dad to come too. So she started making us go to church, but college was when, for me, it became like a real thing that I cared about and everything. It was kind of an a-religious background. Like I knew God created things or believed that, but like it was just kind of this vague thing that it wasn't important. So your tween and teen years, did you get involved in like a youth group, or how'd you end up going into church?
Well, so initially it started with like a boys mentoring program. I didn't grow up with a male figure in the home. So my adoptive parent thought maybe this will be the thing to kind of put him in this. And plus I was having some struggles at that time. Just with school and with just, I guess we can call it behaviorally. In my head, there are air quotes around it simply because a lot of it comes back to stuff that was happening in the environment that I was living in. So it was something that was kind of feeding on itself, but I was sort of being outsourced to other people rather than, it was almost as though the issue was me rather than the environment. And really that's what the issue was, the environment. Of course I wouldn't find that out for another, 10 or 20 years, but
Yeah.
as you do. But yeah, so it started off as boys mentoring, and then, getting involved with the worship team, that kind of thing. Um, that's how I got involved. So it wasn't like a youth group thing necessarily.
It's amazing what you learn in your like 20s and 30s
Hmm.
that it would have been really helpful a decade before to have understood that it isn't your fault. Your
Right.
behaviors responding to the environment that you're in. You're doing the best you can with the resources you have as a kid. Like,
Exactly.
yeah. So then what? So how was high school after high school?
High school years were hard, um,
Mm,
emotionally because of that, because it was like I thought I was a Christian. I was never fully sure. I think Christianity has this way of making you like re up every week, and I don't know what it rededicate yourself. So, and then the goalpost keeps moving all the time. So, you're never really sure if you're a real Christian or not, because it's like you're getting this part right, but then I saw you living like this when you're blah 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 blah, and so there's always this kind of like looking over your shoulder, which shouldn't happen in a loving relationship,
mm.
but it's what we were sold was the loving way to spur each other on in good works, as it were.
Oh,
Uh,
oh, versus. Yep.
so um, teenage years were hard because you're just trying to figure out who you are, and in the middle of trying to figure out who you are, you're still wrestling with, am I enough to be considered a Christian? So it's varying states of unsure, varying states of uncertainty within oneself. And so my teenage years were tough ones because I felt myself always on the fence, wanting to be committed, because I wanted to belong somewhere. As you know, I'm an adoptee, so uh, you really like few things in the world matter more than belonging somewhere. And it's very easy to become destabilized in that way because you started off on really shaky ground by virtue of the fact that you came to, cognizance away from what was your birth parents or what was your birth reference. You're starting off on shaky ground. You don't come to realize it fully until you get older, but all that trauma starts to come to bear the older you get. And so a lot of my teenagers and really into my 20s was trying to prove myself, trying to figure out, where I belonged, but proving I belonged in the places I was already in, and being put in positions in a lot of ways to where I had to prove that I belonged, where I was always in. So that was very, very difficult for me. But I always had music. I was a musician, so I was able to speak that language, and that's kind of how I got through, and that's how I was able to prove my worth. Um, it would eventually become very tiring because it was based on what I did rather than who I was. But I was happy for the 10% of belonging where I could find it.
Yeah, if that's the way that you can get that belonging and feel like you're part of something, because that's a human need. And then you put adoption on top of that, where, like you said, you're starting off with, do I belong?
Hmm.
Because did I not belong before? And now I'm here. And do I belong here?
Yep.
Plus, the church, and I say church, this is an extremely diverse, the whole entire world's version of church is so different. But like,
Hmm.
there's a lot of using people for their gifts until you are just completely burned out.
Hmm.
You don't have anything left to give. And yeah, finding your worth in that, that's hard because, I mean, how else are you finding your worth if that's what they value?
Right.
So, did you go into college? Did you start work? Like, what were your 20s
Yeah.
like?
So I went into college, still playing on worship teams, playing in a gospel group, that kind of thing,
Hmm.
playing concerts, playing shows, doing all that kind of thing while I was still in school. Um, and it was an interesting time, very up and down. It's like you start to figure some things out,
Mm.
but other things still kind of elude you. You're still not sure who you are. You're still not really settled in that. Um, and in my early 20s, I actually was contacted by my biological family, and I hadn't really been connected with them in years. And that caused a lot of excitement, but also a lot of conflict.
Mm.
Conflict not only within, but also conflict, I believe, within my
Hmm.
adoptive family. I think they wanted to be supportive of it, but it's almost kind of weird. And I don't think they knew a whole lot about my adoptive family, and if they did, they didn't tell me. So
Ah, yeah.
I'm trying to figure out who I am. I'm in this in between place. At the time, things were starting to become very, very strained with my adoptive parent. So all of what little comfort that I had come to cultivate was starting to become stripped away at that time, and I was
Mhm.
looking for it somewhere else. But now I'm being bombarded with this new family, where some of them look like me. Some of them have my last name. Some of them, have stories about things that I was involved in that I don't remember. I remember getting a letter from my brother who was in the army at the time. It was in Afghanistan, and was like
Mhm.
asking me what my interests were. And I'm like, oh wow, like it's a weird thing to meet your brother. Um, it's a weird thing to have all these experiences at 23, 24 years old, however old I was. Um, so if I had to put a word to it, my 20s, at least the early part of my 20s, were extremely chaotic. Um,
Mm.
just because I couldn't make heads or tails of anything. Um,
Mhm.
but this is a point in your life where, in a capitalistic sense, you're supposed to figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life.
For the rest of your life, not just now, like forever and ever and ever. Yep.
Right. When I was in high school, one of the gym teachers would say, "What you do the next 4 years determines the next 40," which, I mean, for high school is a bit intense because just in terms of relationships, my graduating class was 593. I don't know if I still talk to anyone from high school still with any regularity. I barely
I do
remember.
not.
Right, I barely remember what I learned in high school, and even college to some extent. Um, so, but you're supposed to have all that stuff sorted out. But it's like I don't even know who my family is.
Yeah.
Um, and then what is the role of God in all this? Did God orchestrate this? Um, and if so, then why does it feel so unsettled?
Hmm.
Um, like where is the goodness of God in all of this confusion? So yeah, it was a lot.
That is a lot. Yeah. Did you have church people around you? Did you have friends? Any college ministry? Any kind of support during this
Well,
time?
so I was in church, but um I didn't really tell anybody about this type of stuff. Um
Okay. Hmm.
Mainly because I didn't trust a lot of the people around me. Doesn't mean they were bad people. It's just who you can go to certain places with and who you can't. Um and the people I could go to for this type of stuff were out of church. They were people I met at college, people who I'm still friends with to this day, 10, 15 years after the fact. Um, People who I could say, yeah, this is really hard or blah, 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 blah. But but on some level, and I've always been more emotional, I've always been more on the sensitive side. And a lot of the men in my life were not. They just didn't function in that way. And so it made things very hard because there was always an expectation of me, or it felt like there was, to function like the other men. And if I didn't, then, you just don't fit necessarily. And that was in family, that was in church. It was just, there was all these things about being manly men in church, but it never really felt right to me. um I knew I was a man, and I knew that's how I saw myself, but the characterization surrounding that manliness never really fit to me. um so most of my friends, as I got older, were women, and
Mm.
that's
Okay.
still true, actually. um, because a lot of them can kind of go to those places a lot more easily than a lot of men can, in a general sense. I knew that I couldn't go to a lot of church people, really any church people, with what I was dealing with, because even though I didn't have the language for it then, I knew that they would find some way to spiritualize it. And on some level, I knew that that would water it down and make it more confusing. Um, like there would be no room for me to process it. It would just begin and end with Jesus. Um, and it's very, very difficult to have a conversation that way when there's a preset ending to it. There's a lot of churches that'll tell you that they have an open door policy, or they'll say you can talk about anything, but the understanding is as long as it begins and ends with Jesus. So if it comes to a situation where you're questioning theology, you know, if you if the end result is always going to be Jesus, then you're not free to ask questions, because questions mean you can land anywhere. And so I think on some level intrinsically I knew I couldn't go there because I knew that they would try to tie some bow on it and that would make it feel inauthentic. Um, of course, I didn't know that then, so I just thought I was being quiet and shy and in a way sinful because you should be able to share. This is family. But if the thing about family in that context is it's kind of thrust upon you rather than more so than it is felt in in a lot of ways. Um, so it's something that's preset for you rather than something that's allowed to kind of exist organically. So while there were ways in which I felt accepted, it felt like it was based on what I do more than who I am.
Mm. You can have built-in community, which can work out wonderfully in church,
Hmm.
and you can have thrust upon you community where it's like you just need to trust these people and tell them all your business. And it's like I can't. Our bodies know something's not right about this situation. This is not a safe place.
Hmm.
Like, and I don't know that we know those words. Years ago, these are newer vocabulary, safe places, and things like that.
Right.
But your body knows, like, something's not right. So what happened next? Yeah.
Um, so I mean, the early 20s were kind of a crazy time. I was still involved in
Mhm.
church. I met my partner Carol. We met at a church service, um, and we started dating really quickly, got engaged really quickly, um,
Yep.
and but it wasn't because the church forced that on us. We just really really fell for each other really quickly, um, and it was interesting because we were long distance. Um, so she was in school. She was away at art school in San Francisco, and I was back on the East Coast. And we grew up 2 hours from each other. So she's from New York. I grew up just outside of Philadelphia. So we're northeastern people. But um, that was another relationship that really was helpful in having a place to go with a lot of these emotions because when things were getting really bad with my adoptive parent, that was one person who I could talk to about it. And to that point, my adoptive parent, I don't really know what happened. Little things would upset them. I was living at home during the time I was in college because I went to a community school nearby because it was what could be afforded. And little things like rooms not being clean, or
Mhm.
things like that became huge things. And suddenly, I was being away from home, going out, doing things that you normally do in your early 20s, and that was causing friction for some reason. Um, and the refrain I hear the most one time when I went out for my birthday, I came back to grab some stuff to hang out. I think I was sleeping over at a friend's place or something like that, and they just kind of went off on me. They didn't know where I was going. They didn't know what my plans were, anything like that. Which again, I was in my 20s. Not sure why there needed to be a whole lot of that, but the thing they said was, "You're changing, and I don't think it's for the better." Um, and it felt like I was shifting and evolving as a person, and maybe they were struggling to have a handle on it because they had control all that time. Or I don't know. I have no clue what that was about, but it was a really, really difficult time.
Yeah.
Um, and like just random outbursts that were really hard to take, and it made the environment even more unsafe than it already had been because it was never really safe in an emotional
Hmm.
way. Um, it never was, but um, it got even less so progressively as time went on. So I remember being the evangelical that I was, praying after an outburst, saying, "Okay, God, if I'm not supposed to be here anymore, then the next outburst will be my sign to go." Um, didn't really have a whole lot of recourse, just to maybe a friend with an apartment, nothing like that. And so a few days later, sure enough, another outburst happens. So I gather maybe 2 days worth of clothes and I put it into the front pouch of my guitar case. I go to class that morning, throw my stuff down at my friend's place, and I never slept another day in the house again. Um, I crashed at my friend's place, and I texted my adoptive parent. And I said, "Hey, I can't come back. I just can't do it." They called me. I didn't answer. The rest of the family kind of was very concerned, and they were like, what's going on?" Um, and so some of them were like, "Yo, what's happening?" And I was able to speak to them, to tell them what was going on. And then I had a cousin who was nearby where I was staying, and they came to see me. And I told them what was going on and what I experienced. And there were a lot of statements from that conversation that stay with me, but the one that stayed with me the longest was, "To be honest, I'm amazed you stayed that long."
So family knew that your home life was not safe?
I don't know what they knew, but I knew that,
Mm,
but what I understood after that conversation was that I wasn't the only family member to have some sort of friction.
I see.
Um, and so what they told me about some incidents that had happened, and they told me about how the family really felt about my adoptive parent, about how they weren't as close as they seemed, and
Wow.
that there was just a lot of stuff, a lot of water under the bridge that had lived there for 35, 40 years. Um, and I was just kind of in the middle of it, meaning that I was being raised in the home.
Mhm.
Nobody said anything, and I don't know if that was to maintain normalcy for me or for what, but it's a hell of a way to find out that you're not on an island. Um,
Yeah.
so that was going on. I was still serving, still on a worship team,
So you're
still,
still in church.
yeah, so all
Mhm.
that's happening. Sort of recap, meet and get engaged to my partner. Meet my biological family for the first time as an adult. Like really meet them. I had kind of seen them when I was about 6 years old, but didn't really remember have any memories. So this was the first time I'm really getting the skinny on things. Um,
Mhm.
Spoke on the phone with my biological mother for the first time in years. Um, all of this stuff was going on in college, still expected to get grades of some sort, uh, and then also serving every Sunday. And eventually, all of it
Wow.
just became too much. And one night, when the worship team that I was playing on was playing at another person's birthday service type of thing, uh, I started feeling really strange, like almost disembodied strange. And they said they took me home early. And the following morning, I began experiencing what are known as anxiety shakes, which is where
Oh, wow.
the stress becomes so much that your body can't take it, and you literally lose control of your body. Um, and I shook for probably anywhere from 24 to 36 hours. I don't remember the exact, but it was somewhere in between that time. So I went to the
Yeah,
hospital the
Benji.
next day, and went there twice in the same day because they gave me Ativan to settle me, and even with the Ativan, I was still shaking. So it was the confluence. It was the confluence of not only what had happened very immediately, but all the things I had felt all those years before and didn't have an outlet for, and eventually my body just couldn't take it. And so that night when I went for the second time, um, most of my adopted family was out of town. This was Thanksgiving weekend, so they were out of town doing something different. But my adoptive parent was still in town, and I didn't tell them what was going on. Um, and I don't think anybody did. Um, at least none of my friends did. I don't think. I think I may have told a family member or something like that, but I didn't tell my adoptive parent because, in a lot of ways, they were the reason I was in that hospital to begin with. So I'm like, you know, I'm not going to make the situation worse for me. Someone contacted them, however, and once my friends were there and they had finally got me calm, they tore into the room like a bat out of hell, basically like, "Hi, what's wrong with you?" Those were the first couple of words. "Hi, what is wrong with you?" Like angrily. Um, And
Oh,
my
wow.
theory is that I think they were angry that they weren't told because they felt entitled to that information. Um, Entitlement is a big theme, and
Mm-hmm.
and they went and talked to my doctors and just kind of made a bit of a scene, and did exactly like they basically proved exactly why I didn't want to tell them what was going on.
Yeah.
Eventually, um, my cousin asked me to have a meeting with my adoptive parent, which I realize now was not a good idea, because there have been some situations in my past that I now understand as abuse. And so it was essentially asking me to face my abuser, and it didn't go well. And they ended up kind of taking my adoptive parent side in a lot of ways. And so it kind of was a visceral confirmation of what I'd already always kind of known, which is that I can trust you, but to a point. So eventually I was, still at that friend's place. Me and that friend had a falling out, had to jump to another friend's place, but I only had a little bit of time to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of my biological sister, who I just connected with, offered a place down in Florida. And so, um, and it was an opportunity that made sense, but at the same time, it was very scary because I'd never lived anywhere
Mm-hmm.
else. I'd never been on my own really, and I was engaged to this person that was in the Northeast, and I didn't know when I'd be able to see them again. It was just all kind of a mess, but ended up going anyway. Um, and that was a whole situation, just because what I was told was going to happen when I got to Florida didn't really happen. Um, I was told that there'd be a place for me to stay, a place for me to sleep, but what I wasn't told was that where they were sleeping, they were going to be evicted from that place, and they didn't tell me. So 3 days into being in Florida, I'm in a hotel with like six other people.
Oh, wow.
But all the while, I was still looking for a church.
Mm. So you're still believing, you're still hoping, you're
I'm
asking like for
still
help.
I'm an eternal optimist. So I'm just like, I there has to be some, if anybody's gonna find a silver lining, it's gonna be me. So I'm like, I'm trying to find, where God is in this. Maybe you're doing something in me. Maybe you're testing me for something. Maybe something bigger is coming down the line that I need to be prepared for. Um, Trying to just reframe it and make it different things in my head.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so when I got there, I started working, and this was the beginning of my classroom teaching life. I was working with the Boys and Girls Club, teaching fourth grade and doing music teaching and things like that. And one of the teachers that worked there was a worship pastor at another church, and so they invited me to come play at their church at that time, and so I went and did it. The work went really well, and they offered me a room in their house to just basically rent out. And it really ended up working out really nicely because it was down the street from where I was working. So did
Oh,
that.
good.
Um, but I would come to find out that the church was not, uh, didn't have the most savory practices. And what I mean is that they were running a scam, essentially, uh,
Okay.
like a very obvious one. Um, the worship pastor sat me down one night and was telling me about how their father, who was the pastor of the church, who we rarely ever saw, um, had made friends with a prince from the Middle East. And on that prince's deathbed, they gave them these certificates of deposit. And but they were worth billions and billions of dollars that needed to be released at a certain time. And what they did was they roped people in, and they said, "Hey, we have access to all of this money. The president knows about it. All these people know about it. Uh, that's supposed to be released at a certain time. We want to give you that money, but before we give you that money to do the things you want to do, uh, whether that be start a business or start a nonprofit or whatever, um, you have to come every month and take these almost like courses, to kind of train you for this kind of thing. And of course, these things cost money.
Ah, naturally.
So, and again, they'll be every month. So on any given Sunday, our church wouldn't have more than 20 people in it. At the end of the
Mhm.
month, we would fill to capacity. So it would be like people flying in from out of town. So this would be like, 850 people, all of them paying
Wow.
100 to $200 per person. And you add that up after a while, you know, to put it, I'll put it to you this way. I went to their house once. They were living in Ronald Reagan's old house. So
Okay.
yeah, it was a huge house.
Yeah.
Um, and I tried to reframe it in my mind of like, okay, maybe God can still move through this. But,
Wow.
you know, I would look up articles and see like, oh, your pastor's being investigated in Texas for doing the same thing they're doing here. And
Gotcha.
I'm pretty sure they shut down not long, like not long after I left. And somewhere in the middle of that, Carol, my partner, wanted to come down and be with me because they were just over school and things like that. And I was trying to prepare for them and had been saving money and was putting money away and was like looking for apartments and things like that. Um, I ended up losing all of that money because the teacher that I moved in with, they didn't own their home. And I came to find out that they were only a substitute teacher, which meant that they didn't have a settled thing in the summer. And so all of my money went to just keeping the lights on and keeping the refrigerator running and all that stuff. And so, but now my partner's coming.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, we come down, we get married, and but it's really, really rocky. Jumping from place to place,
Mm.
staying with family in town, that kind of thing. Uh, but still serving. We end up going to like that's one of the things that is consistent about that period of time is that we always served. Like it didn't really matter when it came to Sunday morning, we were in church. Like there almost wasn't another possibility in our minds.
Yeah.
And so, we found a local church, began serving on the worship team there. Um, did that for a long time. There were ups and downs. Um, Ended up homeless for a while. And that has to do a lot with like my paperwork growing up. My birth certificate and my social security cards didn't have the same names on them.
Paperwork dictates being able to get a place to live and being able to get jobs. But
Everything. So I
yes.
was out of work for like 2 years, just trying to sort that out. And so, and of
Mhm.
course, that raises questions about your adoption and things like that. Um, and
Mhm.
so I was trying to sort all that out, still serving. In between all that, I get an opportunity to surprise my biological mother who hadn't seen me since I was a child. Uh,
Oh,
so
wow.
my sister and I and her family drive up to Philly to go see her. Of course, she's like crying, and it's a whole big moment. And some of my siblings who hadn't seen me since I was really little, I mean, they looked at me like they'd seen a ghost. Um, and I had come to see their side of the story of life had been like without me. Part of the reason they looked at me that way was because they weren't completely convinced I was alive for a lot of my life. I kind of just disappeared, and some of them didn't really know. My biological mother would send up balloons on my birthday every year because, like, almost like in memorial, because they thought I was dead.
Oh, wow. Do you know why? Like, what the story was?
That's where things really got interesting. So at this point, I am in my mid 20s at this point.
Mhm.
And so I remember sitting at a table, and my bio mom, she just starts pouring out basically all this stuff she's essentially wanted to tell me for years. So that's when I find that out. That's when I find out about how I came to be in my adoptive parents' care. I was told the story that, my biological mother was too sick to take care of me. And so I had to come live with my adoptive parent, Which I mean, when it comes to having a biological parent with issues of substance abuse, that's about as softly as you're going to land the plane.
Hmm.
But there was no update to that story. And when I spoke to my bio mother, I told her basically that that was the explanation. And I was expecting for that her story to match with what I'd heard. And then I started watching her
Yeah.
face as I told the story. And it changed. Like there was an excitement. She was happy to see me. Um, but there was a frustration that started to come over her face. And she asked me to repeat it, and so I did. And then she says that's not what happened.
Ah.
And so come to find out that number one, my adoption was not legal. I was never supposed to be taken across state lines, but I was raised across state lines. Um, Nobody had given my biological mother was high during a lot of the pregnancy and during the birth, and had left the hospital briefly, like maybe for a day or so, just in that stupor. But when she came back, her child was gone, and nobody explained why.
Oh, wow. Oh, Benji.
And apparently, there was a confrontation between my
Hmm.
bio and adoptive mother, where my mother found her and basically said, "Where is my child?" And they came to this agreement where um, my biological mother would be a part of my life. And so there was a meeting when I was very, very young, and
Oh,
where I got to meet her, but I don't have a whole lot of memories about it. I was, 5, maybe 6 years old at the time. And so I didn't really have a whole lot of memories of it. And that was supposed to be an ongoing thing. But when my biological mother tried to make good on it, um, she was met with lawyers, basically saying, if you try to contact him, we will sue you.
oh, wow.
So we didn't have to be separated. Obviously, it
Yeah.
wouldn't have meant the same thing because she wouldn't have been my mother. And there's a lot of arguments to be made that she probably couldn't show up for me in that way because she was still sorting herself out. However, what she told me was that the guilt of not handling my situation exacerbated her drug use because she couldn't deal and didn't have the tools for it. So, either way, it wasn't my adoptive mother's call to make, or adoptive parents' call to make.
Yeah.
And so I'm sitting there just like, you know, my entire life history, like 25, 26 years of history, is undone in 45 minutes to an hour, not knowing how to make heads or tails of any of it. And to be honest, it's been almost 10 years and I still don't really make heads or tails of it. It's just a lot still. Um, I remember after that conversation, I just went up to a bedroom nearby and I just cried
Hmm.
because I'm like, where do I come? What does any of this mean?
Yeah.
Because you're now having to start to entertain some possibilities about the reality of the relationships of the people that you grew up around. And
Yeah.
it was one of those moments where it's like, I don't see God in this, but it was that sort of Genesis 50-20 thing of like, what the enemy meant for evil, God meant for good thing. And that's kind of the thing I told myself for the next, 5 years or whatever. And I just kind of tried to push it away, tried to push away the fact that it all hurt. Um, and there were other things on that trip that really, like I understood the degree to which my biological father did not want me around. I understood, and even my half siblings, like his kids, uh, kind of resent my existence um, for a lot of reasons. I was their dad's kid that was born out of wedlock, basically,
Oh,
and
yeah.
that like my existence was a signal for the end of their parents' marriage, basically. And so, like, whether fair or not, I'm a symbol for that. So, being in an environment where they're in the house and they won't even look at me, knowing full well who I am, um, so that stuff, really, really shook me up. soon thereafter, we started going to a new church. And this was the last church we would end up going to, because this is where the churches was really where the crap hit the fan for us. And it was really where we began to question openly things about church. Uh, because the thing about it is that we had been, since we'd gotten to Florida, we had been in predominantly white spaces.
So, like what we think of white evangelical, like mega churches, small churches, traditional.
Um,
Well, you said you're a worship team, so it was more
so
contemporary.
it was one of those multi-campus churches. So if you
Okay,
think of like
yes.
the way that Elevation functions,
Mm-hmm.
where they have, one church but many campuses, there was one of those in Florida. And so we did that for a really long time, portable church. So it was like a church campus essentially that we were serving on. And then the
Mm-hmm.
next church we went to was one church that was a part of multiple churches, like a network of churches all over the United States and across the world. They were very, very missions focused. They were very much about, reaching the lost and doing short term impact teams and things like that going all around the world. That was their whole bag. And
Mm-hmm.
so eventually, we started going there. And it was out of need because of the homelessness issue. We've been bouncing around for so long. And, it had benefits being there. We were able to get back on our feet, and, I was able to get my problems
Yeah.
sorted out with my documentation and was able to get started working a lot in nonprofit, serving people, serving homeless communities. Um, and so there were things that were starting to be redeemed in my life. And so I thought, okay, yeah, this is where it turns around. This is where God's getting the redemption. This is where it's all starting to spin. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and there were things that really did change for the better in that space. But it was there that I really started to understand, or maybe fully admit, that there was a lot of racism in white evangelical spaces. And I think on some level,
Mm-hmm.
because when you're black, like, or really when you're a person who functions as a person of color, you're it's just kind of background information. I explained it in another podcast. I explained it as almost like seeing McDonald's when you're on a road trip. It registers as like that kind of background information. You've seen it before, but it just flies by you because it has to, because you're outnumbered. And on some level, you grow up understanding the power dynamic. And so, like, if you're the only black person calling out racism in a white space, they will turn on you.
Yeah,
Um,
it can be dangerous very
it
quickly.
can be dangerous very quickly. And this is both in conservative and liberal spaces. Because within conservative spaces, they don't like talking about racism. In some liberal spaces, they feel like they've done enough. So you calling them out is like, basically like, I'm trying. Isn't this
Mm-hmm.
enough? Like they feel like they're like, so it's very different, but it's two extremes of the same white supremacy. It's this two extremes of the same power dynamic in the
Yeah.
hierarchy. So you kind of understand when and where you cannot speak about certain things. Um,
Okay.
but certainly in one church, I had heard the parent of the pastor say, while I was in the car, that Barack Obama didn't have the really black experience because he went to Harvard. Um, and then in this new church, when I would explain my fears about being outside after dark because of all of the unarmed killings of black men by police, the thing I was told was, well, if you're doing the right thing, then you shouldn't have a problem. Or being told, or being subjected to a diatribe about Black Lives Matter and how evil it is and how black people don't actually experience racism unprovoked while being driven home from worship practice. Stuff like that.
Yeah.
But you push it away because uh, this is your family. And now, since people have helped you get out of homelessness, now you like almost like owe them somehow. And so there's all these.
The entitlement you mentioned earlier, this feeling of entitlement. Yep.
Exactly, exactly. And so, there's a lot of suppression and a lot of things that happen.
Mhm.
There was one moment when when I lost my job, got in a car accident, and Carol got really sick, like hospitalized sick, in a really, really
Mhm.
short amount of time. And we were on the verge of losing our apartment. And so we went to our church leaders and said, hey, this is what's going on. and they basically rebuked us for not being fiscally responsible, and basically allowed us to lose our apartment, um, because they said that God was teaching us a lesson. Um, to this day, it's difficult for
Because it's
us,
all about individual responsibility, your personal thing that you did. Yes, I
and
understand.
more
Wow.
importantly, from a conservative standpoint, a lot of conservatives don't like actually have this belief that people of color, specifically Black people, um,
Hmm.
aren't working hard enough or aren't trying hard enough. Or so right after dealing with all this stuff, I was being essentially told, well, because you're not getting a dumpy job immediately, you're not, you know, you're not trying hard enough. Basically saying like, have you tried? And I told them, like, McDonald's told me no. I'm trying to do all these things to. And they're like, we get it, but you're still not trying hard enough. And it was always hammered like, if you don't work, you don't eat. If you don't work, you don't eat. They were saying I was
Oh,
lazy.
yes.
Is what they were
Mhm.
saying. And it was me just trying to adjust to everything that was around me, but being told no, you have to like do this, do this, do this, do this, and it was all based on what their assumptions were about Black people going into it, and they didn't really know me. So I spent a lot of time living with that tension, but trying to pretend like it wasn't there, for just the betterment of our experience there. Because if I talk too
Mm.
much about it, then people would tell me like, we'll go hash it out with them. Matthew 18, handle it like a brother. And I was thinking to myself, but they're not going to listen to me because this is what the assumption is. This is the assumption that they're making while having all of the information. So,
Yeah.
but it was like being subjected to gaslighting on the other side of it too. So,
Yeah.
eventually I began to shut down and just was basically reliving my teenage years, in my late 20s because I wasn't safe anymore. And I really wasn't safe at all. I was told that I could be. I was told, like, open door policy and this is church and you should be able to share with family, but I couldn't. And then I would get penalized for that too. That, oh, he wouldn't show up to share this or wouldn't share that, or, it felt like everything was being legislated. Fast forward now to 2020. Everybody's inside. And
Yep.
the pastor, you know, looking back now, there's an extreme, it's a cult. And I know that now just because of the way things functioned, the way there was this almost deification of the leader, um, and that the leader really couldn't do anything wrong. The leader was never really held accountable for things. Um, didn't know that then, but
Yeah.
I always thought it was weird that they kind of held the leader on this pedestal all the time and treated them almost like they were seated at the right hand of God. Um, and the leaders really, really, really pushed living really close together. Everybody lives really close together. So the entire church lived within 3 to 5 miles of each other. Anything more than that, then somebody might say something to you.
Wow. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
little bit culty.
Gathering randomly, or sometimes, with very little notice. If you're not there or if you don't show up to a couple of gatherings, somebody might call you, like, hey, what's going on? Um, you know, Having finances meetings to see how if your finances are in order, um, that kind of stuff. Uh, so yeah,
Yeah.
they sold it as though, like, nobody else is doing church like this. Like we're doing it better. We're doing it differently than everybody else. Always comparing
Mhm.
themselves to Bethel and Upper Room, and saying like, they
Mm.
have this special thing, but we have like it way more holistically than they do. That kind of thing. So 2020 rolls around and we're all home, and the pastor's not doing well, handling it well, because they like it when everybody's together. They're very big on that. But for me, having church over Zoom was a break.
You are not the first person to say that. So many people were like, it was nice. I didn't expect it to be so nice to not for it to be a break.
It was
Yeah.
so nice because, by that point I was on the worship team. I had risen to the level to where I was a music director on that worship team.
Oh, wow.
So, I was always guiding the songs, telling people where to go on stage, just doing that type of stuff. And it was nice because it felt like some part of me was getting recognized, but it was like the most obvious part of me. Like you didn't have to work very hard to get to that place, you know? And so, but hey, it kept me involved and it kept people off my back. So, I was like, this is how I survive. Fine. Um, Again, didn't know that then. I just thought that this was my calling, but it was survival mode all the time, fight or flight all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so to be in a situation where I woke up on a Sunday morning, didn't have to wake up super early, didn't have to plug stuff in,
Yeah.
didn't have to fake mingle with everybody or go outside and be sociable. Um,
Mm-hmm.
when you didn't want to. Um, I didn't have to, during worship time, I could go get coffee and nobody would say anything to me about it. You know, it was just nice. And so I was like, okay, I can do this. I can handle this, even though the situation that necessitated this is awful. I can get down with this basically. And then we started hearing about Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and
Yeah.
Breonna and all these names. And it was a really interesting time in American history because nobody could say they didn't see it. Everybody was home.
Everybody saw it.
Everybody saw
So
it.
many people who would not have paid attention otherwise
Yeah.
were forced to finally see it. Yeah.
And a lot of churches began speaking about it. Churches within our network began speaking about it passionately,
Oh, wow.
about the frustrations of Black and brown people and why they shouldn't have to keep doing this over and over and over and over again. Um, of course, that momentum would not last, but it's what I commonly refer to as black square energy, where you put it up for a little bit and then forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the summer of the black square. Uh, but there was a noticeable silence from our leadership,
Gotcha.
and our church was relatively small. This was maybe 300 people, but
Mm-hmm.
Carol and I represented, I don't know, 20% of the Black population
Oh,
just by ourselves. So there,
just the two of
just the
you.
two of us. So there were maybe 10. And
Yeah.
one of the other people who were there, we were fairly good friends with, who was Black, and I remember them they handing us up, and they were like, "Hey, is it weird to any of y'all that like our leadership isn't talking about this?" And I said, "It's not weird, but it's a problem." And so, like, we formulated a plan to talk to leadership about it, and but we said, okay, we'll give them one more Sunday's grace, and we'll say if they don't deal with it at all,
Yeah.
then we'll say something. That Sunday rolls around, don't say a word. And so we said, okay, we're going to talk to the worship director, who is kind of the pastor's right hand man, and we're going to talk to them because they're a lot easier to talk to and deal with. Um, so that night we were going to do that and just kind of gearing our minds up for it. And then the pastor calls us
Oh,
out of the blue, and they say, "Hey, I heard that there are these things going on. Apparently, they didn't know that all these shootings had happened. They said they didn't own a TV. And I was in their house once or a couple of times, and they don't own a TV for real. Uh, but even if you don't own a TV, someone does. So it feels like,
and there's
and then there's the
the
internet. So
internet.
there's very little reason why you shouldn't know about this, unless you're knowingly trying to push it away."
Yes, exactly.
And so there was a little bit back and forth about that. And they said, basically, we're not going to address it. We're not going to talk about it at all. And their rationale was, if we start talking about this, then everybody's going to expect us to talk about everything. And in their words, if we talk about this thing, then we're going to have to start talking about the gay thing. And we don't want to do that. What they said was, what we'll allow you to do, we'll release you to have a prayer night about it, which is basically them giving us power without any power at all. They want you to have the feeling of, like, doing that, but they're not going to back it in any way, shape, or form. And I knew that was a cop out. And the more they talked, the more enraged I became. And my wife had it on speaker, and I had to walk out of the room a couple of times because I was fuming. And
Yeah.
she literally told them, like, look, we don't feel safe to talk about these things in this space. We just don't. It's a real thing affecting our lives, and we can't talk about it. And
Hmm.
they appeared to hear that, and we said, okay. We said our piece, hung up the phone, and I was ready to leave. I was done. I was not having it. And Carol had to kind of calm me down and say, hey, um, why don't we just try this?
Hmm.
Let's not do anything drastic. Let's just see what happens. Let's try this. And so, like, begrudgingly, I was like, okay, fine, whatever, we'll try it. But I don't like it, and I think it's BS. 45 minutes later, that friend I told you about, they called us and they said the pastor was just yelling at me for an hour, and about the same thing, about because apparently earlier that night there had been a meeting, and some folks had spoken up about the shootings and why there was no discussion about them, and he went off on all of them. The pastor basically
Oh,
accused them
wow.
of having a spirit of accusation, and just all
It's always the devil.
it's always the devil, spirit of accusation, that kind of thing. And so he then called again and then just went off about it. But in doing so, he told our friend that we said that it was safe to talk about these things,
Oh,
which is in direct contrast to what we had just told them.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's what started to becoming clear as our friend was talking was that our pastor was in effect gaslighting our friend using our words.
Mm.
And that's
Hmm.
why I knew I was done. I was willing to give it a try for another couple of for like for about an hour, and then I got that phone conversation. I was done, and it took Carol a little bit more convincing, but
Hmm.
um, the next day, like they had had a dream that night, and they were like, "Yeah, it's time to go."
Mm.
So within the next couple of weeks, we had begun talking to other friends who were wrestling with leaving because of what had happened. They were people who were at that meeting where he went off and called, on the whole spirit of accusation tangent, and we were all kind of just our support group for each other, just trying to sort out our
Yeah.
feelings, not knowing what any of this means because it feels like we're in this in between space. Hadn't even really gotten into a theological discussion as of yet, about whether or
Hmm.
not we'd stay in church or what, but um, we were just sort of all trying to sort it out together. The following Sunday, the pastor starts saying things about how having side conversations breaks down family. And it became clear, oh my God, he's taking a shot at us.
Yeah.
And so it was a thing of like, how the hell do you know we're talking to each other? Um, Eventually, all of us who were kind of on the fence about leaving or were about to leave, had a dinner. And that's when I found out that the pastor has a lot of, dare we say, flying monkeys. Meaning, so flying monkeys is a term when a narcissist or somebody like that has a bunch of people doing the work for them in a way. That's a very loose term, but and it can be interpreted in a few different ways. But basically, you have like these discipleship moments with other people in your church where you share things with them and then you pray through them and things like that. Uh, None of those things are ever private.
Mm.
All of those things get fed back to the pastor.
Ah,
And
gotcha.
so on Sunday mornings, when it seems like, wow, like you must really be hearing from the Lord because I talked about this in my discipleship meeting or blah, 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 blah. Really, they were being fed that information all week. So they can kind of build an aggregate from all of that information. Didn't know
Hmm.
that. Um, and so somebody was telling them that we were all talking. Eventually, we all left at different times. Carol and I left first. And I would get text messages from people being like, please reconsider leaving. We're reading Wide Awake. Please, blah, 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 blah. We need you. And, I never answered back because my thing was like, if you wanted to treat me well, you would have.
Mm-hmm.
And it shouldn't have taken my walking away for you to realize, like,
Yeah.
you're not mad it happened. You're mad you got caught in a really obvious way. And so we end up leaving. That following Sunday was very interesting because it was the first time in 20 some odd years that either of us just got up on a Sunday, and that's what it was. It was just another day.
Mm-hmm.
And there was such a relief about that.
Yep.
It was almost as if my body was like, thank you. This is what
Yeah.
we've been needing for a really long time. We can just say it now. And eventually, the pastor would go on, the following week, the pastor would go on a tirade after a few of us left, and like all lives matter on screen yelling
Oh,
tirade.
wow.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
they would later destroy that footage when we tried to bring it up to their leadership. So the church we were going to was part of a bunch of churches, and the major church was the one we spoke to. And the major church basically said, we can't do anything about it because we're really not their leadership. They just pay for the name and the rights to the name. And, we don't have any real oversight over them.
Yeah. Gotcha. So they don't have authority. They're just outsourcing
Yeah.
their name is
So
okay.
we basically kind of up creek without a paddle. We had told them these horrifying things that had happened to us over the years, and everybody had a different story, but very, very, but like flavors of the same thing. And they just kind of said, oh, well. And
Gotcha.
it really rattled me because it was like, this isn't the way it's supposed to be done. And for a while there,
Yeah.
I was willing to believe that maybe someday down the road I'd find a church that was healthy. But at that moment, I just needed to be
Mm-hmm.
done. And that was just my thing. Carol has a whole different
Mm-hmm.
thing that I'm sure she'll tell
Yeah.
you about. But I just needed to be done. I needed to kind of just turn things off for a while because I had been just bled dry for years and years and years for my talents, for my vulnerability, being told it was on me to
Mm-hmm.
fix everything, only for it to become very obvious that I wasn't the problem, but that it didn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
All while fighting for social justice online, but not seeing any of it in my real life. And so that back half of 2020 I was in a really dark place emotionally. I just felt used and unsupported and all of these things, to the point where it's a minor miracle that I got to 2021, honestly. Um, like sending rambling messages to my friends in the middle of the night because I don't know how to tell them goodbye. Like that kind of thing. Um,
Yeah.
and right when it was on that line of, I don't know what anything means anymore, uh, because I defined my life by this one thing for so long, and it doesn't feel like any of it matters anymore. Um, that's when I started stumbling across, as if by serendipity, I started stumbling across a lot of accounts that were discussing this thing called deconstruction. The more I listened and the more I watched, the more I was like, oh, so there is a name I can attach to this in between place.
Yeah.
Like there is this space that exists where people just aren't sure about stuff. And so I just kind of soaked it all in. And I think just the discovery of that and just wanting to see, like, just the pulling on that thread literally kept me alive. Um, and the more digging into it I did, the more that I began to detangle things, you know, the more ashamed I had been for the way I had treated the LGBTQ community, the more I had realized how functionally racist a lot of the theology is. Not just, and that it really wasn't just one church, because I began to see the way that Bethel responded
Mm-hmm.
and how many of them were convinced that Trump was the guy and that they were saying this while a black girl was leading worship without understanding, while singing songs and making albums with, black artists to almost offset the idea that they might be racist, only to hear stories of people of color who had left that space who were like, oh my God, and then Sean Foyt doing what he was doing, and all, like, and just recognizing that a lot of churches, whether obviously or not, ascribe to this thinking.
Yes.
But this was all I'd ever known. And so I had gotten to a point where I was like, I could try to figure this out. I could try to sort out a way to make this work, but I'm so tired that it almost doesn't even make sense anymore. Like, there's almost more life in letting it go.
Mm.
And so I just decided that I was like, you know what? I can do all the digging I want to. I can learn how to read things in Aramaic and listen to all these scholars and all these people talk about it. None of which changes the fact that the gospel is no longer simple. It's not an open as shut as this person died for you and now you need to be gracious for this thing that you didn't even know was happening. Um, which began to seem more and more abusive as I unpacked it, because you already get enough of that as an adoptee. This situation that you didn't ask to be in, you were thrust into, and now you need to be thankful because you have a roof over your head and you have food. And I'm thinking to myself, in what healthy situation is that ever shaky? Was not feeding me on the table for any of you?
Yeah.
Like we need to, let's unpack that. And I had just gotten to a point where deconstruction meant just letting some things fall apart. Really letting everything fall apart and try to figure out who I am whilst in the wreckage. Um, and as I was doing that, I was thinking through my story and how much I had lived through while at that church. And I started to write down my experiences. And I was going to share it, but I was scared and I didn't want people to come after me and things like that, because there had been situations where other people who had left had been getting messages from people and were trying to meet with other people and being and like yelling at people, and it was a bad situation. Like, people were very, very angry about people leaving. So I was scared, but after a while I was like, you know what, I don't have anything to lose. So in 2021 I put out a thread on Instagram called, why I left my church, and it was supposed to be a series of 3 threads. I put the first one out and it got this really enormous reaction. And suddenly I started being contacted by people who had left that church way before I got there and said, oh my God, you are speaking to something that I've not been able to talk about. And then people who had left while I was there, people who, you know, I was told left because they were bitter and just couldn't, all this other stuff, you know, were like, yeah, that's what happened to me. Yeah, that's what happened to me. Yeah. Or, oh man, that didn't happen to me specifically, but I know exactly what you're talking about. Blah blah blah. Because I would use code names for the people that I was referring to. Um, and they were like, I know this person, and they played along and kept the anonymity going. And what started as 3 threads became 8, and I told the whole story basically. And people who hadn't talked in a while, because some of them were told the lie about the other person and they had been friends before that, were reconnecting in the comment sections
Oh,
and
wow.
sharing stories. And it became this really open space for people to share. What I didn't know was that people at the church got wind of it and were like, and people who I blocked. And so they were literally like, people who were still connected to me were like taking screenshots and sending it to them, and they were talking about it in their small groups, and like it had started some stuff.
Oh,
um,
wow.
so it caused like a minor ripple over there, and has led to some conversations amongst other people. One of my friends, I'm fairly certain, still uses it as a reference now, when I put that thing out 2 years ago, so um, and I think that was the introduction of me beginning to heal from that specific situation, but really to take an honest look at evangelicalism from an outside lens, from a lens that had who's been in it, but now is sitting on the other side and saying, okay, well, what is life like now for me? What is life like? You know, really examining those things, and it opened the door for me to examine that publicly. And a lot of people started to come to my page, from that, and just me kind of processing this stuff in real time. So at the time I put that out, I think I had maybe 600 followers on Instagram. Um, as of now, it just, and after that, it just started growing really fast. So as of now, we are at somewhere around 5,500 followers. Um, just really organically, just by word of mouth, and like people began hearing about what I was doing, and really, it's like me just processing through this stuff and writing it and posting and sharing thoughts about that objectively, but also talking about other things. So my page had become a resource for a lot of anti-racist commentary, because I would do reels about how the word woke came to be, and what it
Yes,
actually means. Yeah. Or I did one about Christian academies and how it was founded on the back of segregation, and how that dovetails within so, and then I became friends with people in the space. I became friends with Tim from the New Evangelicals, and he and I did a whole uh, post on woke, and that drew a lot of people to my page as well. So I kind of found myself in this space of creating, you know, post Christianity, if you will, about what it's like to
yeah,
be in this space now, not just as a person who was even as an evangelical, but also as a black person, because Christianity is so much a part of the black experience, like just culturally. To actively choose to not be a part of that, is there's a certain degree of sacrilege that kind of taps into, because it's like, what do you mean? It's like, that's what we do. um but it had just kind of become unhealthy for me. So I find I function in a really strange space where I'm not limited to just talking about religious stuff. I can talk about racism. I can talk about the political systems within that, and sometimes I can have a lot of fun you know within those spaces too. I do something on my page called 90 Minutes of Never Getting Back, where I literally just, watch a terrible movie and like live Instagram story through it. And sometimes that dovetails with, Christianity. I did a Kirk Cameron movie like a month or two ago. Um, so, or actually I did another movie called I'm in Love with a Church Girl, which kind of taps at that kind of theology as well. So sometimes it's a fun look at, uh, just as a measure of healing. Like, if we spend so much time crying over this stuff, maybe let's laugh about it sometimes too. Um,
yeah,
and that kind of leads me to present day, where I kind of stumbled into being a content creator. I didn't think I would be doing this way. I always liked the idea and thought it would be fun and could be a way to engage myself creatively. But I certainly didn't think it was a thing where people would be asking me on podcasts or asking about like my expertise on things. Um, that part I never saw coming at all.
As someone who has like learned a lot from your page, I almost said retweeted. What is it when you
I
share
think it's
Instagram
reposting.
things? Repost it. There you
Yeah.
go. Okay. Repost
Everybody has a
your
different word
stuff.
for it.
Just,
Yeah.
yeah, I know. But yeah, I've learned a lot. I've laughed. I loved the stuff that you did with Tim Whitaker. That was a good. Like it's just people are learning, and those of us who are willing to like sit and take it in and learn and share it with others. And yes, like you said, you're an eternal optimist. Like the future can look very different. The future can look very different. So
Hmm.
I am thankful for the work that you're doing. How can people connect with you online, Benji? Like how can they find you and see all the great stuff you're posting?
So I would say the front door is Instagram. I am over there at Hey There Benji. Uh,
Okay. We'll have all this in the notes. So go
yes.
ahead.
Hey There Benji there. I'm also Hey There Benji on TikTok. I'm on Twitter at _ Hey There Benji. Carol and I do a podcast called Important Things with Ben and Carol. So you can find that on wherever you get podcasts, Apple, Spotify, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But we also do a Patreon version of it as well. So that's at patreon.com/important_things. And that helps us out a whole lot, especially now. It's been a really interesting season for us. I'm just coming off of being really sick with long COVID for about 2 months, and had to literally forfeit my job because of it. So it really helps when people join. And so, yeah, those are really the main places you can find me.
Benji, thank you so much for doing this. I am honored that you would share your story, and I know our audience will not just learn a lot, but empathize with a lot of things that you talked about. So thank you again for being on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
My final thoughts on the episode. I feel like the word family was just weaponized in Benji's situation. It just seemed like whether at home, having been adopted and being expected to be thankful that you have been put into this wonderful situation and don't question it, don't expect anything different, like weaponizing the word family there and then, or the concept of family, weaponizing family at church. Like, this is your family. We wouldn't do that. Like, trust us. You belong here. You fit in here. Family and belonging and love and relationships are all things that humans absolutely need. And when they're used against us, like that is just, I don't know, the epitome of harmful for children, for adults, for any of us. Like, I'm so honored that Benji would share his story. And it's amazing to watch, as he called himself, an eternal optimist, to watch him be able to tell his story with authenticity and grace toward the people who've been in his life. And at the same time, seeing the things that were harmful. And it's beautiful to see someone who's been through so much consciously move into spaces where he can help others grow and become better people. Like, it's humanism at its finest. And I personally am thankful for the content that Benji creates. Thanks again, Benji, for being on the podcast. This was really good for me and really honored that you would share your story.
The secular grace thought of the week, inspired by Benji, is humanism as anti-racism. First, we obviously have to acknowledge that throughout history, both humanists and atheists have had their fair share of racism. But the core ideas within humanism and the secular grace that we're trying to espouse here on this podcast is the opposite of that. It is the embracing of our humanity and the humanity of others. Much of the civil rights era and beyond time period, the Black community was saying, I am a man, I am a human being, something that should not need to be said, but must be acknowledged. The idea of secular grace is embracing the humanity of others It also requires acknowledging that my experience is not universal, that someone with a different color of skin may experience the world in a different way. As Benji talked about, it was the background noise that just was always there. I think this goes beyond just racism as well to discrimination in general. As we get to know people who have a different life experience, a different cultural background, sexuality, gender orientation, as we know them as a human being, it is very, very difficult to hate a person. It is as we keep people as others that we are able to hate them. While embracing your own humanity, embrace the humanity of others and love them with secular grace. Next week, we have Christian Lomsdalen, who is the president of the Norwegian Humanist Association. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. The differences between the United States and Norway are pretty dramatic, and they have things like coming-of-age rituals within humanism. It's a really interesting conversation. Check that out next week. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network.